How are we as Christians supposed to respond when the government doesn't even acknowledge our faith? How do we fight back when we are ridiculed and marginalized and largely left out of the national conversation? And what is an effective Christian response to the secularization of America? That's what we're going to talk about today. Hi, I'm Ellis Orozco, and welcome to my channel, a place where we think out loud about the Bible and how its teachings have an impact on our daily lives. If that sounds interesting to you, please be sure to hit the subscribe button and check back regularly. Okay, so last week I told you that in this lesson we were going to start to look at Daniel chapter 1, at Daniel and his friends and how they developed these strategies to survive and thrive in a polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda. I promised we were going to look at that, and I lied. Okay, I actually didn't lie. I just, as usual, overestimated how much I can get done in one lesson. We're going to get to Daniel chapter 1. We're going to get to Daniel and his friends and the strategies they used. I promise. We're going to start next week. But this week, I need to take some time and just pause. And I want to spend our time talking about why I say America is polytheistic with an aggressive agenda, and why the Babylonian culture in general and the Hebrew exile experience in that culture in particular is an important study for us to understand how to thrive in that kind of culture. To accomplish that, I want to take a deep dive today into the idea of America as a polytheistic culture and try to identify the crux of the Christian struggle with that culture. What is really happening? What is really going on? It may not be what you think. What do I mean by polytheistic? Well, to put it simply, Americans are worshipers of many gods, worshipers of many things. Now, I don't mean primarily that there are a lot of different religions moving in, through immigration, like Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs. That is certainly happening, but that's not our biggest problem, nor is it the biggest source of polytheism in our country. If it were just a matter of a leveling of the playing field with other religions claiming that their God is the true God, it would be a very simple matter. That's not our biggest problem. Other religions are not the driving force behind the polytheistic culture in America, not even close. You see, Daniel understood this about Babylon. He understood this in the Babylonian culture. Daniel knew exactly what his biggest problem was, and it wasn't the gods of Babylon. He didn't see himself in a fight against Marduk and Ishtar, the two primary gods of Babylon. He didn't see it that way at all. So what is it then? It's actually what some are calling the secularization of America that is our biggest challenge as Christians. Now, let me try to explain what I mean by that and why it's our biggest problem and how it is driving polytheism. The latest Pew Research shows that within the next decade, Christianity in America as a religion will drop under 50%. That is to say, within 10 years, Christianity will no longer be the majority religion, and there will not be a majority religion in the United States. But by the year 2070, about 50 years from now, I'll be dead by then, but by 2070, the nones, N-O-N-E-S, those who claim no religious affiliation at all, the nones will be the majority in the United States. Those with no religious affiliation will be in the majority by 2070. That will signal the secularization of America, and it's already happening. Christian philosopher Charles Taylor, in his massive and super important book, A Secular Age, he may have been the one who coined the secular age. Taylor, in his book, identifies three ways in which we view the secularization of America, three lenses if you will. And I want to use those lenses. I want to use his framework for our understanding of both Babylon and modern day America. I have a link to his book if you'd like to get it in the comment section. I don't make any money off of that. It's not an affiliate link. It's just a direct link to Amazon if you want to get the book. But Taylor goes through the three ways we view secularization. And the first way in which we view the secularization of America is in terms of public spaces. So that in this sense, secularization is defined in terms of public spaces being emptied of God or any reference to the transcendent or to any reference to ultimate reality. We just don't talk about those things in the public square, and so the public square is being emptied of all God talk. In other words, some would argue, we are secular because we have emptied our public spaces of any God talk, of any talk of religion. Now, Taylor does describe this phenomenon pretty accurately. So let me quote him here. He says, as we function within various spheres of activity, economic, political, cultural, educational, professional, recreational, the norms and principles we follow, the deliberations we engage in generally don't refer us to God or to any religious beliefs. The considerations we act on are internal to the rationality of each sphere. Maximum gain within the economy, the greatest benefit to the greatest number in the political arena, and so on. So the point that Taylor makes here is that this is in striking contrast to an earlier age when the Christian faith in particular had an authoritative voice in these spaces, even if it was an informal voice. Professional clergy and theologians were allowed to speak authoritatively into these kinds of deliberations and decisions, and the spiritual was acknowledged as an important and even vital consideration. That no longer exists. Almost nowhere. Wherever you find it in the public square, you have found a unicorn. Now, this is the area where most conservative Christians are choosing to confront and fight. Perhaps because it's the easiest to see or it's the easiest to attack. I don't know. But we want to get God back into the public schools. We want to get God back into the public spaces. We want to get God back into the government, you understand? They've emptied it of God, as if God could really be banished from a particular space by legislative measures, right? This reaction actually diminishes faith in an all-powerful God. Like God really needs me to get permission from the government for him to enter into a public space? Are you kidding me? Do we not believe in the all-powerful, omnipresent God of the universe, right? So it's not surprising then that Christianity has actually proven to flourish when separated from the powers of the government. When kicked out of the public space, Christianity has proven historically to flourish. Poland under communist rule, China, Russia, and other places have shown that Christianity is at her best when speaking prophetically to the powers of the state from a position outside the corridors of power. And it is actually corrupted and its true spiritual power gutted when it is married to the power of the state. You want to see a really ugly place to live? Marry the hierarchy of the church with the power of the state, the power of the sword, and you will see misery and suffering everywhere you look. The power of having exclusive entree privileges into these public spaces has actually proven to weaken Christianity, not strengthen it. And it's deceptive because it seems to strengthen Christianity when the Christian faith is given exclusive entrance to public spaces. But my contention, and I think the data proves it, is that what it is actually doing is it's strengthening cultural Christianity, which is a pale and puny and pathetic substitute for true Christianity. You see, Daniel and his friends showed no inclination to try and replace Marduk with Yahweh in the Babylonian culture or in Babylonian public spaces. On the contrary, they studied the nature of the Babylonian gods. And when they took the equivalent of the Babylonian LSAT, they passed it with flying colors. The Bible reports they knew more about the Babylonian gods than most Babylonians did. They studied and understood the culture. And Daniel did not try to use the power of the sword, which at one time he had the power of the sword. He had tremendous power in the empire. But he did not try to use the power of the empire to elevate Yahweh above all other gods and to force the Babylonians to worship Yahweh. Daniel had this internal clock. He had this internal fortitude, the internal strength and the internal faith to understand that Yahweh didn't need his help to accomplish that. He knew from his own prophets that someday Yahweh would overthrow Babylon and Yahweh would punish Babylon and Yahweh would rescue the Hebrew people from captivity. He knew that Yahweh was going to do that and Yahweh didn't need his help to get it done. He had real faith. And many Christians today don't seem to have the faith in that kind of God. They seem to think that they serve a God who needs their help to get into the public square. God doesn't need your help to get into the public square. He's already there. He's everywhere. Open your eyes. No one can banish him from that space. He's there. So that's the public space issue. Some say that we're becoming secularized because the public space is being emptied of God, so to speak. Now, the second lens to view secularization in America that is part of Taylor's framework is the idea of the moving away from faith by individuals. As opposed to the public space, we're now talking about more the private space. Let me quote Taylor here. He talks about it. He says, secularity consists also in the falling off of religious belief and practice, in people turning away from God and no longer going to church. So this too is one that many Christian leaders lament and bemoan, that more and more people are moving away from the church, more and more people are moving away from religion. And the statistics seem to prove that people are leaving the church in droves. They're leaving religion in droves. And so you can look at that and you can see that this also is a lens through which we can view secularization, this movement away from religious practice. Now, this does not signal a complete rejection of the spiritual or the transcendent. Although there are those who move away from religion to atheism, those are very few. Most people are simply seeking other ways to live their spirituality in this world other than the traditional routes of religion and church. As I will argue later, spoiler alert, we are all worshipers of something. This movement of people away from religion and the church has actually very little to do with the public space secularization, although some would draw a strong connection, and there is some connection. But I think this movement of people away from God, away from religion, away from the church, has more to do with the third lens that Taylor talks about. The third lens in Taylor's framework is something that he calls the conditions of belief, or the conditions for belief, so that we can view the secularization of America through this idea of the conditions for belief. And for Taylor, this is actually the most important one, and he spends the rest of his 900-page book really unpacking what this looks like, tracing it through history and trying to understand it. And what he means by conditions for belief is a shift that can actually be traced historically from a society where belief in God was unchallenged and unproblematic to one in which belief in God is understood to be one option among many other options, and oftentimes not even the easiest one to embrace. Okay, and for Taylor, this is the most important aspect of the secular age, and he devotes the bulk of his book to talking about it. So let me quote Taylor again here. This is what he says. The change I want to define and trace is one which takes us from a society in which it was virtually impossible not to believe in God to one in which faith, even for the staunchest believer, is one human possibility among others. This absolutely bears true in my experience in the time that I've been alive. I grew up as a young boy in the 1960s. I grew up with Christian parents. Part of my Christian testimony, in fact, is that my parents, and not just my parents, but my extended family, my aunts and my uncles, my cousins, the little church that I grew up in, the people there, they so modeled the love of Jesus. They so nurtured me. They so, in some ways, insulated me and cared for me and taught me about God in such a way that it would have been virtually impossible for me not to accept Jesus Christ as my Savior. It would have been difficult for me not to accept Jesus. That was the milieu, not only of the church, not only of the family life in that time period, but it was also the culture. The culture respected and valued the importance of that soup, if you will, that milieu, that air that we breathed for the nurturing of faith. And so I grew up in a day and a time and a place in the South where it was actually difficult not to believe in God. Belief in God was not challenged. That's not the case anymore. Hardly anywhere. It's just not the case anymore. And what many Christians want to do is that they want to go back in time. They want to go back to that time, 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever. They want to recapture the past with the strategies that worked in a culture that largely embraced their particular brand of Christianity. And it was, by the way, their particular brand of Christianity. The culture I grew up in was embracing of, in particular, evangelical Christianity in the South, very much embraced. And people want to go back to that, but it's impossible The physics says it's impossible. You cannot go back in time. You cannot recapture that time period. The math shows in physics, actually, that it is impossible to go back in time. Now, Marty McFly and Back to the Future notwithstanding, that's all fantasy. The math shows that the arrow of time points only in one direction, the future. It's impossible to go back. It is actually, the math shows, possible to travel through time into the future, but not backwards, you see. And so those who want to go backwards to that time, to recapture that culture, are delusional. It's never going to happen. Daniel understood that in his culture, in his day, in his time. You see, Daniel would kneel 3 times a day on his mat and pray facing Jerusalem. But he didn't stay there. He didn't live in the past. He didn't live in Jerusalem anymore. We're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. He wasn't in Jerusalem anymore. Now, Jerusalem for him was that place where the culture was such that it would have been impossible for Daniel not to believe in Yahweh. Daniel had been so nurtured, so loved, so taught in Jerusalem, in his faith, in love for Yahweh, and love for the law, that it would have been impossible in that culture for Daniel not to accept God, Yahweh. But in a moment, in an instant, Daniel is transferred from that culture where it's impossible not to believe in Yahweh to a culture where Yahweh was just one more God among many, many gods, among many, many options. And he knew now that he was living there. He could not go back to Jerusalem. The prophets had already told him he would never go back to Jerusalem. So every day, Daniel would stand up from his mat in his prayers. He would turn away from Jerusalem and he would face Babylon. Daniel understood that he had to live and thrive and work and worship in Babylon, not in Jerusalem. Now, he never forgot Jerusalem, but he didn't live there. He lived and worked and thrived in Babylon. And he did that in direct obedience to the word of the Lord. It was the word of the Lord that told him, when you get to Babylon, plant gardens, build houses, get married, marry off your children, build a life there, work for the prosperity of Babylon, because if Babylon prospers, you will prosper. So, if that's the case, that we now lived in this secular age, and there's no way for us to go back, then you might be asking, why then, Ellis, do you say that we live in a polytheistic culture instead of saying that we live in a secularized culture? You see, this is where what is happening in the culture crashes into the eternal. This is the governing paradox of the age we live in, the secular age. And the paradox is this, that while the secular age supremely prizes what can be rationalized or deduced or proven, and is incredibly skeptical of anything beyond that, there is at the same time this eternal spark in the human spirit, this eternal spark in the human soul. There is a persistent and universal longing in every human being for the transcendent. And it cannot be escaped, it cannot be denied, it cannot be squelched, and it cannot be satisfied with anything that the secular age has to offer, because the secular age knows nothing about the transcendent. It doesn't even acknowledge it. But we, human beings, we were built to worship. That's it. We were built to worship. And when the created sequesters itself from the creator, no matter how noble the cause, no matter how important the goal, when the created empties itself from the language of religion, which is the language of transcendence, and when the creature refuses to entertain the language of the eternal, then the creatures start to worship created things. They have to. They have no choice, because they have to worship something. Take God out of the equation, and you start to worship the stuff of creation. And the stuff of creation is fleeting and finite and temporal and fixed to the material world. And therefore, it will never satisfy the hunger for transcendence, because it has no way of knowing transcendence. Now, the Bible calls that idolatry. When the creatures attach their affection to the temporal, to the finite, to the material, to created things, The Bible calls that idolatry. Now, I have to say, there's a danger in that. I even hesitate to use the word idolatry. It's a biblical word, and it's the right word to use. But I don't particularly like using it because it immediately conjures up in most people's minds all kinds of false images. First of all, using the word idolatry sounds very judgmental. In some ways, it is very judgmental. But more importantly, it's deceiving the way we think about idolatry in our culture. Because as soon as I say idolatry, you're thinking about, oh, these horrible pagan idolaters, who are worshiping in very obvious ways other things, maybe other gods, the Muslims or the Hindus, or pick your group that you want to attack, whatever. That's the way we tend to think of idolatry, but that's not what idolatry looks like in the secular age. The Hindus and the Muslims and the Sikhs are not our biggest problem as Christians at all, not even close. Because in a secular age, you see, the secular age that Charles Taylor describes in his book, the secular age that I've tried to line out here through the three lenses, that secular age creates an idolatry that is everywhere. It's in the air we breathe. It's in the water we swim in. We can't get away from it. It's a constant temptation day in and day out for us to attach our affections to created things. It's everywhere. It's literally the air we breathe. We are all, in some sense, guilty of this kind of secular age idolatry. And Daniel and his friends understood this. They saw it in the Babylonian culture. They saw what it looked like, and they developed strategies for overcoming it. Now, next week, we're going to start to unpack exactly what they did. We're going to start to unpack those strategies. So I hope you'll stick with me through it. I hope that this has been helpful, or at least thought-provoking, maybe provocative. Maybe you hate me now, that's fine too. At least I'm getting some reaction. Let me know what you think in the comment section. If this has been helpful for you, please stick with me. We're going to get there, I promise you. I know it sounds really bad right now. We're at the bad news stage, but we're going to get to the good news, I promise you. There is gospel in this, I promise you. So I hope it's been helpful. If it has, give this video a like. It really helps the algorithms to get in front of more people. And be sure to hit the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed, and check back regularly. I hope that God blesses you this week, and I can't wait to see you next week.